Me, can I help you?
No, I live here. Just moved in last week.
Really? You sure you got the right house?
Pretty sure my name's on the mortgage.
I'm calling the police. You look suspicious.
You mean I look black?
Maybe.
Well, then you got police.
The call itself lasted less than a minute. A neighbor reported a man moving boxes into a home that did not feel right. Nothing sounded urgent. Nothing sounded dangerous. At the time, it appeared to be a routine request for police assistance. The dispatcher logged it. Units were notified. Procedure began moving forward, quietly, automatically. What the caller did not know, what no one on that line fully understood, was that this single decision would not remain local. It would be reviewed, recorded, escalated. Weeks later, the incident would no longer belong to a neighborhood or even a city. It would enter a federal system designed to examine power, intent, and consequence. The outcome would be permanent. The record would be official, and the price would be far greater than anyone involved expected, because the mistake had already occurred. The only question left was where the line was crossed. The first patrol car slowed as it entered the street. No lights, no sirens, just a marked vehicle responding to a neighbor's concern. Boxes were stacked near the curb. A moving truck idled nearby. The man at the center of the call did not appear alarmed. He did not raise his voice. He did not attempt to leave. He continued unloading, moving between the truck and the front door, behaving exactly as a resident would. From the outside, the situation looked resolved before it began, but procedure had already taken over. The call had created a record. The record required a response. And once authority arrives, silence can be misread as defiance. Questions followed that carried no accusation on their surface. Who lives here? How long he had been inside? Whether someone else had given permission? Each answer narrowed the space for discretion. Each moment reduced the chance to disengage. What neither the caller nor the responding officers could see was the chain forming behind them. Documentation, review, oversight. This was no longer about a neighbor's discomfort. It was about how power reacts when summoned without cause and how that reaction is preserved. Because from this point forward, every decision would be logged. And later, those decisions would be read very differently. The man unloading the truck had planned the move carefully. The house was purchased weeks earlier. Paperwork signed. Utilities transferred. Keys issued through a closing process that left no ambiguity about ownership or permission. He had chosen the neighborhood for reasons that were ordinary. Proximity to work, a quiet street, a place that offered privacy after long hours spent inside federal buildings where discretion was not optional, but required. His career did not invite attention. It demanded restraint. Years of service had conditioned him to document first, speak carefully, and allow systems to function as designed. He had spent much of his professional life operating inside those systems, enforcing court orders, transporting defendants, and protecting judicial processes that depended on calm compliance rather than spectacle. There were no complaints attached to his record, no disciplinary history, no public controversy. His work was defined by procedure, not personality. On that afternoon, none of that was visible. He wore casual clothing. He moved furniture by hand. He exchanged brief, polite acknowledgments with passing neighbors who glanced and continued walking. There was nothing performative about the scene, nothing that invited confrontation, nothing that required clarification. The boxes contained household items, books, kitchenware, documents sealed in folders that never left his possession, a habit formed by years of professional caution. He did not anticipate an encounter with law enforcement because there was no reason to. The move complied with zoning rules. Parking was lawful. The residence was his. From his perspective, the day represented closure, a transition completed, a routine milestone that marked stability rather than disruption. What mattered for what followed was not his title, which remained unspoken. It was his credibility, his consistency, his absence of any behavior that could reasonably justify suspicion. By the time officers stepped out of the patrol car, the foundation of the case was already set not by accusation, but by contrast. Between what was observed and what had been reported, between a lawful act and a response that would soon exceed it. This grounding mattered, because when escalation arrived, it would not be driven by uncertainty. It would be driven by something else entirely. Before authorities shifted the tone of the afternoon, the environment remained unremarkable. Traffic moved steadily at the end of the block. A lawn sprinkler clicked rhythmically 2 houses down. The moving truck completed its final scheduled stop of the day. Nothing suggested urgency. Nothing suggested risk. The man paused occasionally to wipe his hands on his jeans, checking items off a printed inventory sheet taped inside the truck's cab. He moved with the efficiency of someone accustomed to planning and verification, not improvisation. Each box went to a designated room. Each step followed a quiet internal order. From the sidewalk, the scene communicated permanence. Furniture, not luggage. Appliances, not duffel bags. The visual language of settlement rather than arrival. When officers approached, their initial posture matched the environment. Measured, observational, no commands, no raised voices. The questions that followed sounded administrative. Routine clarifications that often precede quick disengagement. Name, purpose, duration. He answered without hesitation. He explained the move. He indicated the residence. He remained where he was. At this point, nothing required continuation. The information provided aligned with what was visible. The scene presented no conflict that needed resolution. But procedure does not always end where logic does. The call still existed in the system. The description still carried weight, and the expectation of follow-through began to reshape the interaction. A request was made to remain on site, not an order, a suggestion framed as policy. Time began to stretch. Minutes passed without incident, but without release. This was the final moment when the encounter could have concluded without consequence. When authority could have recognized sufficiency and stepped away. When the record could have closed quietly. Instead, questions repeated with subtle variations. Confirmation replaced acceptance. Presence became justification. No law had been cited. No violation articulated. Yet the balance had begun to tilt. The normalcy of the afternoon did not vanish all at once. It narrowed, compressed into shorter responses and longer pauses. This was the threshold. The point where an ordinary event stops being ordinary not because of danger, but because discretion fails to disengage. And once that threshold is crossed, the outcome no longer depends on circumstance. It depends on how power chooses to proceed. The shift did not announce itself. It arrived through tone rather than action. What began as observation became instruction, not framed as suspicion, but as process. One officer stepped slightly closer, reducing the physical distance that had previously allowed the exchange to feel informal. Another repositioned near the patrol car, no longer watching the street, but the man himself. The posture communicated presence. The presence communicated expectation. The questions changed shape. Instead of asking what he was doing, they asked how long he had been inside the home. Instead of acknowledging his answers, they asked who else had access to the property. Instead of concluding, they asked again. Each question carried the implication that clarity had not yet been achieved, even though nothing new had been introduced. The request to produce identification followed. It was framed as routine. It was framed as cooperative. It was framed as something that would make the interaction easier. He complied. The document was examined longer than necessary. Names were repeated aloud. Information was transmitted over the radio, then confirmed a second time. Still, no violation was stated. No legal threshold was articulated. The presence of authority began to justify itself. A neighbor stood at a distance, watching. Another slowed while walking past, drawn by the static scene that now carried tension without explanation. The officers remained professional in appearance, but their language tightened. Statements replaced questions. Expectations replaced dialogue. He was asked to wait, then asked again. Waiting became the condition. At this stage, the encounter could still have ended. The information was sufficient. The circumstances, unchanged. But procedure, once engaged, rarely reverses without permission. A call was made for additional confirmation, not backup, confirmation. The explanation offered was vague, referencing the need to clear things up. What needed clearing was never specified. Time extended further. He adjusted his stance, not to leave, but to remain balanced during a conversation that no longer moved forward. His voice remained even, his responses remained consistent. He did not raise objections, but he did ask what, specifically, was being investigated. The answer did not address the question. Instead, it referenced policy, procedure, standard practice. Authority, when uncertain, often retreats into language rather than law. A request followed that carried more weight than the ones before it. A directive, still polite, but no longer optional. He was told to step away from the doorway, not because of danger, not because of obstruction, but because the officers needed space. This marked the first moment where compliance altered his access to his own property. He complied again. The neighbor who had made the call was no longer visible, but the effects of that call continued to shape the scene. What began as concern had become leverage. What began as a report had become justification. The officer's demeanor reflected a quiet certainty that the situation required resolution, even if the reason for that resolution remained unstated. A second patrol car arrived. Its presence changed the dynamic immediately, not through action, but through implication. Authority had escalated. The interaction now carried the appearance of seriousness without the substance of cause. This is the space where discretion narrows and momentum replaces judgment. Questions resumed, now layered with repetition and slight variations designed to elicit inconsistency. He remained consistent. His answers did not change. The facts did not change. The scene did not change. Only the interpretation did. A statement was made that reframed the entire encounter. He was told that until matters were resolved, he would need to remain where he was. The phrasing avoided words like detained or restricted, but the meaning was clear. At this point, the authority present was no longer responding to a call. It was responding to its own continuation. Every additional minute created a stronger justification for staying. Every moment of compliance reinforced the appearance of necessity. This is how escalation occurs without force, through accumulation, through repetition, through the quiet refusal to disengage. No single action crossed a dramatic line. No single statement triggered confrontation. Instead, the boundary eroded. What began as a neighbor's discomfort had transformed into a controlled environment governed by procedure rather than evidence. The system had not identified a crime, but it had identified a subject. And once authority assigns that role, the path forward becomes difficult to interrupt. Because from this moment on, the interaction was no longer about resolving uncertainty. It was about preserving the rationale for everything that had already occurred. And that rationale would soon be tested. At this stage, the encounter crossed into a zone defined less by observation and more by justification. The language used by officers shifted toward concepts that sound procedural but carry legal weight only when specific conditions are met. Requests were framed as cooperation. Delays were framed as verification. Restrictions were framed as temporary. None of those frames, on their own, establish authority. They only function when paired with a lawful basis that is articulated and supported by observable facts. That basis never arrived. The original call described discomfort, not danger. No allegation of a crime had been made. No witness reported a threat. No behavior observed on scene contradicted the explanation given. In ordinary circumstances, this is where discretion ends the encounter. Instead, the continued presence of officers created a circular logic. The fact that they were still there was used to imply that something remained unresolved. The unresolved status then justified staying longer. This is a common checkpoint where encounters drift. Remaining on scene is not, by itself, a detention. But directing a person to stay, restricting movement, or conditioning release on compliance moves the interaction closer to one regardless of the language used. Here, the requests accumulated. Stand here. Wait there. Step back. Each directive was minor. Together, they altered control of the space. Another checkpoint emerged when identification was retained longer than necessary. Verification is permissible when tied to a specific inquiry. When the inquiry is undefined, verification becomes delay. The questions repeated did not seek new facts. They sought confirmation of earlier answers. In legal terms, repetition without cause does not strengthen justification. It exposes the absence of it. Throughout this period, no explanation was offered that connected the original report to a legal standard requiring continued control. The officers did not cite a statute. They did not articulate a violation. They relied instead on phrases that signal authority without invoking law. Policy, procedure, standard practice. Those phrases describe internal guidance. They do not create external power. Another checkpoint appeared with the arrival of additional units. The presence of more officers can escalate safety concerns when circumstances demand it. Here, the circumstances remained unchanged. The escalation served perception rather than protection. Perception matters because it alters how authority is experienced. Multiple units create pressure. Pressure invites compliance. Compliance is later used to argue consent. This is where misunderstandings often arise for civilians. Silence is interpreted as agreement. Cooperation is interpreted as permission. Waiting is interpreted as acceptance. But cooperation does not retroactively supply legal cause. By the time officers stated that he would need to remain on site until matters were resolved, the interaction had crossed into a space that requires justification. The absence of that justification did not halt the process. It merely postponed the reckoning. The record continued to build. Audio captured tone. Video captured posture. Logs captured timing. Each element would later be reviewed not for intent, but for alignment with legal thresholds. This phase is not dramatic. It is procedural, and it is decisive. Because once authority relies on accumulation rather than cause, the outcome no longer depends on how calm the subject remains. It depends on how the record reads when examined without urgency, without pressure, and without the need to defend a decision already made. That examination was coming. The turning point did not occur on the street. It occurred later, inside a system built to read encounters without emotion. What had been routine procedure became review material the moment the documentation was preserved in full. Audio from the initial dispatch call, body-worn camera footage from multiple angles, timestamps showing how long the encounter continued after all observable questions had been answered. Separated from the pressure of the moment, the sequence looked different. The dispatcher's log showed the original report exactly as it was made. No allegation of a crime, no description of a threat, only a perception of something not right. That perception, once transcribed, stood alone without supporting detail. The video filled in the gaps. Footage showed a man remaining stationary when asked. It showed compliance without hesitation. It showed identification produced promptly and returned late. Most importantly, it showed what never appeared. Evasive movement, contradictory statements, attempts to leave, or behavior that could reasonably justify escalation. Time markers became critical. Minutes passed after verification was complete. More minutes passed after additional units arrived. The interaction continued without new information entering the record. In legal review, duration is not neutral. Prolonged encounters require progressively stronger justification. Here, justification weakened as time increased. Another layer emerged through audio. Tone matters when words remain neutral. Commands were avoided, but expectations were clear. Phrases suggesting obligation appeared without corresponding legal explanation. Reviewers did not need to infer intent. They assessed alignment. What actions were taken? What authority existed at each step? Whether those actions matched the authority claimed. The evidence did not escalate emotion. It clarified sequence. The moment of restriction when he was told he needed to remain became a focal point. Prior to that moment, officers retained discretion. After it, discretion required cause. No cause was documented. Once the material reached federal reviewers, the analysis widened. The question was no longer whether officers acted politely or whether tension remained low. The question became structural. How a system responds when a call rooted in bias triggers authority without boundaries. At this stage, another fact entered the record. The man's professional role, previously irrelevant to the encounter, became relevant to jurisdiction, not as a shield, but as a trigger for oversight. Federal involvement did not arrive as retaliation, it arrived as procedure. Internal review escalated to external inquiry. Local logs were requested. Training records were examined. The case no longer depended on recollection, it depended on preservation. This is the point where authority loses its ability to reframe events. The footage does not argue. The timeline does not negotiate. The record simply exists. And once it exists, interpretation becomes inevitable. Because the evidence did not show an encounter spiraling out of control, it showed an encounter refusing to end. That distinction matters. What followed was no longer about a neighbor's call or an officer's judgment in the moment. It was about how systems behave when asked to justify why power continued after its purpose expired. And that question would not be answered locally. The Federal Review did not isolate a single decision. It mapped a pattern. Investigators examined prior calls from the same area, noting how often vague descriptions resulted in prolonged police presence without articulated cause. Language appeared repeatedly: concern, discomfort, something off. Each instance produced a similar response. Verification extended beyond necessity. Disengagement delayed without explanation. The pattern was not dramatic. It was consistent. Training materials emphasized officer safety and public reassurance, but provided little guidance on disengagement once suspicion failed to materialize. Officers were taught how to arrive. They were not equally trained on when to leave. Supervisory review focused on compliance metrics rather than outcomes. Reports were assessed for completion, not proportionality. As long as procedures were followed in sequence, the absence of legal cause rarely triggered correction. This structure rewarded continuation. Dispatch protocols amplified the issue. Calls framed around perception rather than conduct entered the system without filtration. Once logged, they carried institutional weight regardless of substance. The call itself became justification for presence, even after its premise dissolved. Internal audits showed no requirement to close an encounter once verification concluded. Time on scene was not flagged as a risk factor. Prolonged engagement was interpreted as thoroughness, not overreach. This was not the failure of one neighbor's judgment. It was the failure of multiple safeguards designed to prevent exactly this outcome. Supervisors reviewing the incident initially found no violation of departmental etiquette. Officers remained calm. Commands were restrained. No force was used. On paper, the interaction appeared controlled. But control is not legality. Federal reviewers applied a different lens. They evaluated not tone, but authority. Not politeness, but justification. When asked to identify the moment where continued restriction became necessary, the record offered no answer. That absence repeated across prior cases. The department's response mechanisms prioritized risk avoidance over rights preservation. In ambiguous situations, officers were incentivized to stay rather than disengage. The system treated uncertainty as reason to continue rather than reason to conclude. Accountability measures existed, but they were backward-looking. Complaints required harm. Oversight required escalation. Without a visible incident, patterns remained buried in routine. The case surfaced because the evidence reached federal channels intact, not because the conduct was unique, but because it was preserved. Once that preservation occurred, the system could not isolate responsibility to one officer or one caller. Decisions were distributed across dispatch, supervision, training, and policy. Each step contributed incrementally, none sufficient alone, all decisive together. The review concluded that the encounter reflected a structural vulnerability, how bias-triggered calls can activate authority without built-in mechanisms to deactivate it when justification fails. This vulnerability did not depend on malicious intent. It depended on omission, no clear off-ramp, no required articulation of cause, no penalty for continuation without justification. The findings emphasize that systems fail quietly, not through dramatic abuse, but through normalized drift, through repetition that becomes routine, through discretion exercised in one direction only. What made this case different was not the presence of wrongdoing alone. It was the clarity with which that wrongdoing could be traced across institutional layers. By the time conclusions were issued, the narrative had shifted. The question was no longer whether the neighbor's call was inappropriate. It was how a system allowed that call to reshape an encounter without resistance. That shift carried consequences beyond the individuals involved. Because once a failure is defined as systemic, correction cannot be limited to discipline. It requires structural response. And that response was coming. The resolution did not arrive quickly. It arrived methodically. Once federal jurisdiction was established, the case moved into a procedural phase defined by documentation rather than testimony. Investigators did not rely on interpretation. They relied on records already created by the system itself. Internal affairs reviews were reopened with expanded scope. What had previously been assessed for professionalism was re-examined for authority. Supervisory approvals were reviewed alongside timestamps. Dispatch decisions were cross-referenced with departmental policy. The findings were not framed as misconduct driven by intent. They were framed as violations driven by failure to disengage. That distinction mattered legally. Rather than alleging malicious action, federal reviewers focused on unlawful continuation. Authority exercised beyond justification, even without force, constituted a deprivation of rights when it restricted movement without cause. Civil liability followed that framing. The municipality was named not as a symbolic defendant, but as the entity responsible for training, supervision, and policy design. Individual actions were evaluated, but the legal exposure rested primarily with the system that enabled them. Negotiations unfolded behind closed doors. Risk assessments replaced public statements. Outside counsel reviewed precedent. The evidence limited defenses. Video contradicted post-incident narratives. Audio established sequence. Logs removed ambiguity. Settlement discussions accelerated once it became clear that litigation would place systemic practices under public examination. The cost of disclosure exceeded the cost of resolution. The agreement that followed was specific. Monetary compensation was authorized. Policy revisions were mandated. Training requirements were formalized. The settlement did not admit intent. It acknowledged impact. In parallel, administrative consequences proceeded on a separate track. Supervisory reviews resulted in corrective action. Performance evaluations were amended. Training deficiencies were documented and addressed. The outcome was not dramatic. No courtroom confrontation. No televised verdict. It was decisive. The legal record reflected that authority had been exercised without sufficient cause, and that such exercise carried consequences regardless of demeanor or outcome. The absence of arrest did not negate the violation. The absence of force did not excuse the restriction. Federal oversight remained in place beyond the resolution of the individual case. Compliance reports were scheduled. Audits were required. The system was obligated to demonstrate change, not promise it. For the individual at the center of the encounter, the resolution restored more than time lost. It established clarity. The record now reflected what the encounter had lacked from the beginning: articulated boundaries. For the department, the case became a reference point, not an anomaly, but a marker, a documented instance where continuation replaced cause and the law intervened. This is how legal consequences operate in structural cases: quietly, formally, irreversibly. Once entered into the record, they do not fade. They inform policy. They guide training, they alter risk calculations, and they remain available for comparison when the next encounter is reviewed. The impact of the case extended beyond the individuals involved, not through public outrage, but through institutional recalibration. Departments rarely change in response to a single incident. They change when a record exposes vulnerability that can be measured, cited, and repeated. Following the resolution, policy language was adjusted to address disengagement explicitly. Officers were required to articulate cause not only to initiate an encounter, but to continue one. Time on scene became a variable subject to review. Supervisors were instructed to question duration, not just demeanor. Dispatch protocols were revised. Calls based solely on perception without reported conduct were flagged for limited response. Documentation standards were updated to require closure criteria, ensuring that authority did not persist by default. Training modules incorporated the case as a reference point, not as a cautionary tale of misconduct, but as an example of procedural drift. Emphasis shifted toward recognizing when suspicion fails to materialize and when withdrawal protects both rights and legitimacy. The case also influenced broader legal analysis. Civil rights attorneys cited the resolution when evaluating similar encounters. Federal reviewers referenced its framework when assessing prolonged detentions lacking articulated cause. The distinction between arrival authority and continuation authority became clearer in practice. Public discourse around bias-driven emergency calls evolved incrementally. The focus moved away from motive and toward consequence. The question was no longer why someone felt uncomfortable, but what systems do when discomfort is translated into power. For communities, the outcome reinforced a principle that often remains abstract, that legality is not defined by tone or intention, but by limits. Authority must justify itself at every stage. or it expires. The closing effect of the case was not condemnation. It was definition. It defined when an encounter should end. It defined what continuation requires. It defined accountability without spectacle. The law did not respond emotionally. It responded structurally. And in doing so, it left a record that now sits quietly among others available, comparable, and enforceable. Not as a warning, but as a standard,